There we go. But and the narratives, as we've discussed, are more indirect, where there is the biblical truth is given in the form of a story, but it's not usually stated directly as to the point of the story. So we have to figure that out. But for epistles and poetry, um, the biblical instruction, the doctrinal truths are given more directly. Now, in poetry, it's a little different because you have figurative language and imagery and these things. Um, but mostly it is given directly. And so a diagram is very helpful because it can help us see the key connections between the various phrases and clauses within the text. So we want to remind ourselves of some of the, excuse me, the principles, especially again, the grammatical principles that help us to understand how these phrases and clauses connect. And I normally, my approach to this isn't just learning grammar for the sake of grammar, but we want to know how the language works, how it functions. That's what we're after ultimately. Whether we can identify a noun, an adverb, or a participle, or a gerund, or uh, a relative clause. All these terms. Sometimes we get lost in them. But most importantly is just how it works. And so I try to focus on that. So we will use grammatical terms like conjunctions and participles and prepositions, things like that. But really try to understand how it works, how it functions. That's our goal ultimately. And so with that, we did start a few sessions ago. We sort of reviewed Psalm 117 and um, some of the overview types of discussions regarding diagrams. So I want to get more into the details. We covered this, we reviewed this process in the last couple of sessions for constructing a diagram, which was to first identify the independent clauses in the sentence, really the first independent clause, and then from that, identify the remaining phrases and clauses in the sentence. And if you remember, uh, basically, language is broken up. We have paragraphs or stanzas in poetry, and those stanzas are made up of sentences. And those sentences, which reflect a thought, are made up of phrases and clauses. And so those are the basic building blocks of the sentence. So every sentence has at least one independent clause. If you remember, a clause is basically just a subject and a verb. And a phrase is a group of words that go together that don't have a verb and a subject, but a clause does. And if you remember, we have two kinds of clauses, right? Does anyone remember what we call those? The two kinds of clauses?
Dependent, independent,
Dependent.
right?
Yeah, great. Dependent and independent. And so an independent clause stands alone, gives a complete thought. So it's a subject and a verb, sometimes an object, that makes complete statement. So I I preached a sermon. That's a complete thought. Um, and that's independent. Now, a dependent clause contains a subject and verb, but it depends on something else. So, if the clause was who preached a sermon, um, that or when I preached the sermon, that is dependent because that word when tells us that this clause, this action, um, happened at a certain time relative to something else. So when I preach the sermon, that word when tells me that it doesn't stand alone. It's not making a complete thought. It's dependent on another thought. So, for example, I was tired when I preached the sermon. All right. I was tired would be the independent clause. It presents the complete thought. When I preached a sermon, maybe I should be typing this. Sometimes it's easier to. So if I had said I was tired when I preached the sermon, again, I was tired would be my independent clause here. When I preach the sermon would be dependent. Again, because of this word when. All right. Or uh, another example might be um, uh, she read a book after she did her homework. Okay. So here she did her homework. That is a clause, the subject she and the verb did, object homework. But notice this word after before it tells us that this clause is dependent. All right, it doesn't stand alone. Now, if the sentence was only she did her homework, that thought stands alone. But by adding this word after in front of it, now tells us that what follows, the clause that follows, is dependent. And it's dependent on the independent clause that is given at the beginning of the sentence. She read a book. And then after she did her homework tells us when she read the book. All right. And so this is an important thing to keep in mind. So we have clauses, again, which are a group of words that go together that contains subject and a verb. And a phrase does not. It's a group of words that go together. It does not contain a subject and a verb. So it doesn't present a complete thought. Now, when we discussed this before, remember we talked about phrases, they always modify. They always depend on something else in the sentence. They always modify another word in the sentence. Okay? They never stand alone. Now with clauses, again we had the independent. An independent clause does not modify something else because it stands alone. Right? It gives a complete thought. But a dependent clause always or modifies another word in the sentence, like a phrase, dependent. That's why it's called dependent. It's not independent. It doesn't stand by itself. It's dependent. And then we saw a couple examples here. All right. So these are critical points to understand because in the diagramming, what we're looking for is these phrases and clauses. Because again, remember, a sentence is an independent clause plus additional phrases and additional clauses. So what we're trying to do is in the diagram, see the structure of the text, and that structure is presented or represented by the various phrases and clauses and how they connect to one another. And so we had looked at Psalm 117 before, just as a small example of that. But once you're able to see the structure, once you're able to figure out where all the phrases and clauses go, then that sort of helps us to see how the author was communicating his biblical truth. It helps us to see what is being emphasized or what is more important. Right? The independent clause makes a statement, and then the dependent ones support that. Chunsi, do you have a question or a comment?
Yeah. Uh, I was just thinking because the Bible we are reading and studying, most of us, is all in English. So it's all in translation. So could it be that the translator somehow, is supposed to be a dependent clause, but he translated it into a independent one, and when we study that, it become an independent one.
Yeah, actually, that is the challenge because you're exactly right. That does happen, even in the really good translations, because there are times where when you try to present the idea translated, um, if you just follow the literal translation, if you translate it literally, sometimes the more literal translations are harder to read. For example, like Paul in Ephesians 1, it's one Ephesians 1, I think verses 3 to 14 is a 170 word sentence. He just kept going. And so translating that um, can become difficult because it's very complicated. You have this really long sentence where he doesn't stop. He keeps having like relative pronouns, who or whom, and and participles, and he never he never really stops. So you'll notice in those translations in English, there are many sentences. It breaks it up. So it does turn dependent clauses into independent ones. And if you don't know the original Greek, you wouldn't see that. For example, I'll just show you. This is a really good question, and it's an important one to realize. So if I go back to Ephesians 1, and here I've got showing you the legacy standard translation. So let me start with like the ESV here. You can see this. Try to increase the size. Um, so notice, okay, so blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in Christ with every spiritual blessing, even as he chose. So he's still going, same sentence, chosen us in him, that we should be holy and blameless before him. And then notice there is a period here. If you guys can see that. So that the translation ends the sentence here, starts a new one. In love, he predestined us for adoption. And that keeps going until the end of verse 6. He blessed us in the beloved. Notice there's a period there. It starts another sentence in him. But in the original Greek, uh, we don't have. So notice it says he in love he predestined us. So that's a clause, independent clause. Subject he, predestined is the verb, us is the object. But let me see what the legacy standard does here. Verse 5. Notice here in the legacy standard, maybe I'll do it this way. Sorry, I hope this isn't confusing. I'll try to be clear. Um, Here I've got just a bunch of translations, comparisons. Oh, but I don't have. Let's see, how can I do this? Hmm. Well, maybe let's just flip back and forth. So notice here in that verse 5, there is no period at the end. It's a comma. And then it says, by predestining us to adoptions as son. If you remember the ESV said, right, in love, he predestined us. So it ended the sentence, we should be holy. Sorry. We should be holy and blameless before him. And then it starts a new sentence. In love, he predestined us. So it made that a dependent clause. Sorry. An independent clause here. But if we look at the LSB, the legacy standard, it didn't make it an independent. It kept it as a dependent phrase in this case, by predestining us to adoption as sons. You guys following me? You see the difference? So this is exactly the question that Chunsi had. So in actuality, if you go to the original Greek, here at the end of verse 5, it says in love, there's in love, and then there's that word in blue. That word in blue, okay, this is getting frustrating. That word in blue is predestining, a participle. It's not an independent clause. So the LSB tried to keep it more literal, closer to the original Greek text. The ESV chose to make it a separate sentence in order to make it a little more clear. Now, the idea God predestined us, that's not that same idea is expressed in both translations, but here the ESV presented it as an independent statement when actually it is dependent. It's a phrase that's dependent on what went before it. He chose us in him. That is a independent phrase, a clause. And then by predestining us. So if I go back to the LSB, that's the idea. He chose us in him is the main statement. When did he choose us in him? Maybe this would be a good one to to show you the diagram here and the difference. Okay. So here's verses 4 and 5 from the LSB. All right. Just as he chose us, where in him, when before the foundation of the world, why or result that we would be holy and blameless. Where? Where would we be holy and blameless? Before him. And then in love, okay, there's a question of where that goes. I think it goes with predestining. So I would put it back here. But notice this by predestining now doesn't stand alone. It's dependent. It's a modifier. And I would say it modifies, yeah, I think you said it. How? By predestining us to adoption. Okay, so it's telling us how he chose us. So I put it under chose. So all of these are modifying chose. Okay. In him would be the idea of sort of where before the foundation of the world is when. And then that we would be holy and blameless would be the result. And then we have so this is how the LSB would be diagrammed. All right. And then notice just as actually is also a dependent clause, which goes to what's before it. But all the rest of this here is modifying chose. Okay. So that's the LSB, which I think is closer to the Greek text. But if you were diagramming the ESV, this would be the difference. So here's the ESV. Okay, we'd start even as he chose us. And again, where he chose us in him. When? Before the foundation of the world. So this is all going to be saying that we should be holy and blameless before him. And then notice now, oh, period, new sentence. In love. And then here's the independent clause, which we would bring, and actually, we bring it even further over. He predestined us for adoption. Okay, so let's see if I can, hopefully you can see this. I'm trying to get it all on the same screen here. So you see there's a difference here, isn't there? In the LSB version, we see this is all of this is connected to describing chose. He chose by predestining us to adoption. But in the ESV translation, he predestined us is now a new statement because it's framed. They translated it as an independent clause rather than following the participle, which is what it is in the original Greek. Participles, by the way, are not independent. They don't form independent clauses. They're a phrase. You guys following me?
Yep.
So, and then we see this if we go back to the ESV, you'll see, like I said, at verse 7, it also ends a sentence, starts a new one. Let's see what the LSB does at verse 7. Now, verse 7, notice the LSB also did the same thing. It decided to break up the sentence. But if we go to the Greek text, it doesn't begin a new sentence. It starts with the phrase, in whom we have. All right. So it's like I said, this is all in the Greek text, all one sentence. But that makes it difficult for the translators because then if they just one long sentence, it would be very confusing, potentially very confusing to a reader. If you're just a regular person, reading the Bible and you come to this text and you like the sentence keeps going and going and going, the person can get lost. Because most times, right, when we read the Bible, we're not diagramming, we're not thinking about the grammar, we're just reading. And so this is the challenge that translators face. Do they try to simplify the sentence, make it easier to read, or do they keep it most literal? And this is a challenge every translation faces. Even in the Greek, it's hard to follow because you're going in whom, okay, where's this go? And and so he keeps using participles and relative clauses and things like that. And so it's easy to get lost even in the original text. So then when you try to translate it, it makes it all the more challenging. One other example. Hebrews 12. We know this passage. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder. Now, notice here, if I were to just take verse 1. Okay. Again, this is the ESV translation. All right, so therefore, since we are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside. Okay, that's the every weight. This is the independent clause. And sin. Which sin? The sin which easily so closely clings to us. And second independent clause, let us run. How? With endurance. The race. Which race? The race set before us. And technically, the race is the object of run. Okay, so I would connect it this way. Let us run the race. Okay, so notice the ESV translation has let us lay aside every weight. That's one independent clause. And then it has a second one. Let us run the race. Okay, that's the second independent clause. So here in the ESV translation, he's making two statements. And I don't know if we'll get to it today, but I was going to talk about the conjunctions. We have a coordinating conjunction here. So it's connecting two grammatically equal statements. In this case, it's connecting this independent clause with this one. So if we were outlining this for a sermon, we'd have the two points, right? The first one, right? Let us lay aside every weight and sin. And then the second would be, let us run with endurance. Run the race with endurance. Okay? So we'd have 2 points here. You follow me? Any questions? All right, this is the ESV. And by the way, the New American Standard is almost the same. All right, I can show you that here. New American Standard does the same thing. Since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin, and let us run with endurance. So 2 independent clauses. Now let's look at the Legacy Standard. Verse 1. And if we go with the LSB here, as I diagram it, you'll see difference pop out. So we have the same therefore, and we have since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us. And then notice laying aside every weight. It's no longer an independent clause in the LSB translation. It's a participle. Laying aside, so it's not independent. It's not an independent clause. It's a phrase. Starting with the participle, laying aside every weight, sin which so easily entangles us. And then, now we get to our independent. Let us run the race with endurance. Let us run with endurance the race. Which race? The race set before us. Okay, so this second part, we have the independent clause, let us run with endurance, just like run the race, just like with the ESV translation. But notice the difference here, laying aside every weight is no longer, it's not translated as an independent clause. So in the LSB translation, you would not have 2 outline points, you would have only 1. Let us run the race with endurance. And the laying aside actually modifies that. So what we'd have underneath, we'd have the reason, right? Cloud of witnesses. And then we'd have how. Laying aside. How we run. and then with endurance. So these would all be supporting points.
Oh.
All right. So then the question is, well, okay, yeah, so we see here the diagram will be a little different and the emphasis will be a little different. In the first translation, we'll have two equally important points. First, lay aside every weight and sin. Second, run the race with endurance.
Mm.
But in the LSB translation, we have one main idea. Run the race with endurance. And then we have, these are all supporting ideas.
Mm.
Whereas up here, let us lay aside every weight. And then we'd have um, the reason to lay aside every weight is the cloud of witnesses. And then the with endurance would go with let us run.
Yep.
Okay. So you see, this is how it changes. So then I think the obvious and most important question will be, well, which one is more correct? Is the LSB closer to the original, or is it the ESV? Well, when we go to the text, this is what we see. And again, we're going to have to go back to the Greek, but here, therefore, right, having cloud of witnesses surrounding us. And then here it is, laying aside. It is a participle. Maybe here the easier way to see this would be to go to the interlinear. Should have done that before. BibleHub.com. And this is how you can figure this out. It's going to take one extra step for you to, unless you can easily read Greek, you'll have to go to this help, which is, so we go to Hebrews 12. I pick interlin. All right. Hopefully
Yeah.
you can see this. Let me make it a little
Having
bigger.
laid aside.
Yeah. So if we go through and here you get so the Greek text is in the middle, and then you have the literal translation from this interlinear version here. And then yeah, if you go down, do you notice here it is. Having laid aside every weight and the easily entangling sin. Um, we should run with endurance the race set before us. So here's the independent verb and subject, we should run or let us run. But the other one, it isn't let us lay aside, it's having laid aside. So it is a participle. So the LSB, I think, did a more correct translation in this case. All right, the ESV, in order to, I think, and the New American Standard did the same thing here, actually. So it's not just, I don't have I'm not against the ESV. The New American Standard did the same thing, let us lay aside. So both of those translations. But the LSB recognized that it actually is a participle, laying aside every weight. And so what's the significance? What's the importance? Well, as I noted in the diagram, the significance is this. If you have the ESV, or I could put the NASB translations, they indicate by translating it as two independent clauses it gives that 2 points you would be making. So again, and then the reason to lay aside would be the cloud of witnesses. But actually, the LSB, which is closer to the original Greek, rightly indicates there's really only one main point here being made, not two.
Mm.
And that all of these modify that. And if you study Hebrews 10 through 12,
Yep.
then I think you would also see this, that the focus is running the race to endure, because
Yep.
the people that are being written to are considering walking away from Christ, going back to Judaism. And so when we get to chapter 10 in Hebrews, the author begins to make this appeal. Look, Christ is the greater. He's the greater than the angels. He's greater than Moses. He is the high priest, the mediator. Why would you go back? You know, Jesus is the only way forward. He's the only sacrifice. So he's making this point, and then the application of it is endure. Don't quit. Don't walk away. And so chapter 11 is the examples of those who endured by faith. And then he gets to the end in chapter 12. The greatest example of endurance is Jesus. And so his main point is, let us run with endurance.
Yep.
Why do we do that? Well, we have a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, cheering us on, telling us of the faithfulness of God. How do we do that? Laying aside every sin and encumbrance, having laid aside. So I think that's talking about repentance and faith. Since we have laid it aside, since we have turned from sin to follow Christ, don't quit, don't give up. And then finally, with endurance. So run the race with endurance. So I think the translation, one, it follows the original Greek more accurately, and two, it better reflects the immediate context by focusing on running the race to endure. That is the main idea. So how do we know when this is happening? Because if we're only looking at the English text or any translation, right, we're dependent upon the translators. And how closely are they following the literal original? And this is, like I said, always a difficult translation decision. The more literal we are, the more difficult it may be to understand the translation. But the less literal we are, we run the risk of not being as accurate. So that's the tension that the translators have. And so I love the ESV translation. I think it's really helpful, really good. So I'm not against it. But there are some examples here where we saw that it was a little bit less literal translation in order to make it more readable. But by doing that, they sacrificed accuracy. So they made a new point, an independent point from something that really wasn't. It was dependent in both cases, both of those examples. And like I said, the New American Standard did the same thing. And even the LSB did it in Ephesians 1 at a couple places because they had to break up the sentence. It was too complicated. So what do we do to try to ensure, or to at least recognize or see what if the translation is doing that? And the interlinear is one way to do that. So for example, I showed you here with pull it back up. I showed you here with Hebrews that this was not an independent clause, which actually a participle is dependent. If we go over to Ephesians, the example I gave you there from Ephesians 1, I think it was around verse 4. Yeah, so here's verse 4, right? Just as he chose us in him for the foundation, or holy and blameless. And then here it is, having predestined us. So it is a participle, not an independent verb, not an independent clause, right? Remember the ESV had had in love, he predestined us, so it made it a regular verb, independent clause. But if we go to the interlinear, it's not. It's a participle. And then we went down, I think, verse 7. Yeah, verse 7, we had the ESV had in him we have redemption. So again, it made this a independent clause. We have redemption in him, that period. But notice if we go to the interlinear, it's in whom. So it's modifying here. It's not a new sentence. Now, in that case, though, the difference in meaning isn't as significant because it's saying the same idea, really. It's not as significant as this, he predestined us. Or in Hebrews, the let us lay aside. We can still see the connection there, but that's the challenges. So what we have to do is, and this I think module 5, hopefully you did this, Yichai, we're supposed to do some more advanced exegesis, and that is to, when you do the diagram, you're going to have to go back to the interlinear and just see if one way to do this is how I recommend it. Usually I'll say do the diagram in your translation, whatever that is. And again, I'd recommend ESV, NAS, or LSB. Those are the best ones to diagram because they are the more literal ones. NIV is not a good one to diagram. It's easy to read, but they've done more of this breaking up and the translation, modifying things. So it's a good one to read, but not to do the diagram, not to study. And so do it in your translation, and then look at the other translations, like the NAS. Let's say you're doing an ESV translation, then look at the New American Standard or the LSB and compare the translations. Are there any differences? Not just in the words used, but even in, the ESV has an independent clause, has a regular verb here, but the Legacy Standard has a participle. That's a big difference. But which is it? Well, let me go to the interlinear and see what this word is. And if you go to the interlinear, as I showed you here, you can see, if we're looking at Ephesians 1, verse 4, and we're looking at that word predestined, we can see, it's a participle. And you can see that if it's hard to read here, here's the Greek word, here's the most literal translation of that Greek word, and then below it on the interlinear, you have the parsing. And notice, if you can see it here, I can't make it any bigger. It says aorist participle.
Yeah.
So it tells you it's a participle. It's not a regular verb. It would have said indicative or imperative if it was a regular verb.
Yeah. And
but it doesn't.
And then we give up on the normative masculine singular. That one I give up.
Yeah. I mean, some of these grammatical details, you'd have to really know the Greek to take full advantage, but at least we can check, okay, is this a participle or a regular verb?
Yeah.
Because you would have noticed if you compared ESV and LSB, you would have seen the ESV says predestined, regular verb. LSB has by predestining. That's not a regular verb. That's a participle. That's a big difference. Or in the Hebrews text, where it has laying aside every sin in the LSB, but the New American Standard and ESV has let us lay aside. So you would see, oh, that's a big difference. And you can go to the interlinear and it'll say, ah, it is a participle. Okay, and that's exactly what we saw. Let me take us back to, I can. Yeah, here we go. That having laid aside, we can look, right here it is. That word apothemenoi, having laid aside, and then we can go to below that and see, okay, what does it say? Aorist participle. Okay, it doesn't say imperative. So, for example, if we go down to let us run,
Yeah.
if we go there, notice it says present subjunctive active, not participle. But here it says participle. And we'll Lord willing, get to participles, talk about those. But participles are modifiers. They're not regular verbs, right? You could say, I walked, or uh,
Having walk.
having walked.
Yeah.
I went to the store, walking all the way. All right. I went to the stores. The main sentence, walking, is modifying how I went. Or I went to the store, taking a cab. Right? Taking's a participle. Walking's a participle. Those modify a noun or a verb. Okay, they aren't a main verb. Now, if I said I walked to the store, that's a main verb. Or if I rode a cab, that's a main verb. But if I say riding a cab, that's not a main verb. That's a participle. So it modifies. And the significance of that, again, if we go back to the Hebrews example, right, is how it changes really how we see the structure and what the author is focusing on. Again, by translating it as a regular verb, let us lay aside, as a command, as first command, and then the second one's let us run. That seems to then show, okay, the author's giving us two main ideas here, two actions to carry out. But if we recognize it's a participle, laying aside, then that's not a main action. There's only one main action in the LSB translation, which, as it turns out, by going to the interlinear here, having laid aside, we see the LSB in this case is closer to the original. And so we should follow this translation.
Yep.
Okay. Or going back to the Ephesians one, right? Just as he chose us, and then all of these modify that, rather than has he chose us, and where he chose us, when he chose us, and then, new thought, he predestined us. Well, no, it's not a new thought. It's actually modifying chose here. So it really can have a significant impact on the diagram, which then will impact how you see what the author is emphasizing. So you could they could take what's supposed to be a modifying statement, and then in the translation, it can look like a main statement, which wouldn't be as accurate. So, right, I've heard many sermons on Hebrews 12 where it gives the two commands. First, you need to lay aside every sin and every weight. Now, that's a true statement, But I don't think that's what the author of Hebrews is saying there. He's saying there mainly, let's run with endurance. How do we do that? Laying aside, having repented, having laid aside every sin and turned to Christ, let us run with endurance. Right? That's a little bit different focus, and I think more accurate, more closely reflects what the original. So the one thing we can do that is helpful is going to the interlinear and trying to see actually from the original, oh, okay, it is a participle here. But this is more effort. This takes more time. But as Paul told Timothy, be diligent to show yourself approved. Now, Timothy knew Greek, so he wouldn't have to go to an interlinear. He could see it. But in our case, we are not Greek scholars, and so we have to rely on those who gone before us in doing the translation, but we do have some tools like an interlinear which can give us some guidance and insight. So if you compare the translations, you'll see the difference, and then you can check the interlinear to see which translation is closer to the original. All right, so as you guys know, I like to give long answers to short questions, but I think your question, Chunsi, was a very important one that we have to recognize. If we're going to use a translation, this is I don't want to say weakness, but maybe the challenge of the translation is it's not going to be perfectly matched to the literal. It just won't. We can't, you guys know this. You know multiple languages, right? And you know you can't exactly match two languages. You do your best, but it's really, you have to know the original language at the end of the day, or at least have the tools that can help us better get closer to the original. And thankfully, we have things like the interlinear, which are a great tool for us to at least help answer some questions. Okay. Thoughts or questions on that? I think that's all we're going to get to tonight, but I caught this. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead, you Chuck.
Oh, thank you. No, thank you for the, I think the excellent example of Hebrews 12 verses 1 and 2. I think it makes it very clear. First, how we understand the authorial intent. What was the Hebrews writer talking about, laying aside and running the race with endurance as two main points, or the main point is really running the race with endurance, in fact, finishing the race, because towards the end of chapter 11, when he says that, because chapter 12, verse 1 start with but therefore, end of chapter 11, in fact, the Hebrews writer says that all those old saints, or what we call heroes of the faith, that he quoted in chapter 11, they have not been made perfect yet.
Yeah.
Apart from, all right, so we are in that, if I may use the phrase, the traditions or the long line of the weaknesses of faith. And in fact, the main point is actually about, if I may use the phrase, is finishing the race with endurance, looking at Jesus. So and Pastor Tim, I think that's an excellent example, but that NIV and ESV and NASB seems to give us the two main points, which is to lay aside and to run. But really, the laying aside is a process on how to run the race, important as it is, but really it's the race that is the main message. Because, I mean, if the process of laying aside is one of the main messages, then being sawed into two will be one of the main process as well, or being thrown into the lion's den. That is definitely not the focus of chapter 11, but rather he's giving us a whole stream of example of the old saints, how their faith, I'm not sure, I didn't check whether the word make perfect in verse 40 of chapter 11 is the Greek word teleos. If it is, then it's the idea of stretching that telescope until it is completed. So I think the idea then in the immediate context support the idea of finishing the race.
Yeah.
So it's an important example of how we may be skewed in our hermeneutics and not getting it as accurate as we can.
Yeah. Yeah, the word perfect there, yes. From teleos, the idea of being made mature, complete, finished.
Yeah.
And then it draws attention more to, looking to Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, that 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 also that's the another looking is a participle, so it's modifying how to run the race with endurance by looking to Jesus as our example.
Yeah. I'm not sure, Pastor Tim, if I got the picture correct. I seem to remember I read somewhere the behind the idea or the word teleos, which is make perfect, is the good old telescope, like the Captain Cook kind of telescope. You have to pull it to the max in order to see the faraway object clearly. So the idea of being that old telescope being pulled to the max in order to see clearly what is the object from far. I seems to read somewhere, can't remember whether it's correct, that picture of teleos, in a sense, is a telescope, the old telescope being pulled to its max.
Yeah, I've heard that illustration. I think it can be helpful in some applications, some passages. I think the idea though is maturity is the emphasis,
Yeah,
coming to a completion.
yeah,
Teleos is the idea of final, the end, um, and so I think that's what's going on there. He's go through all these examples, but in this life they did not reach, they did not fully complete. It's only in glorification. So, um, but they walked by faith,
yep,
uh, and many of them not having realized the promises made, like Abraham, for example. He didn't see the promises
yeah.
made to him fully, but yeah. So again, I'm not trying to be critical of the translations. I know they have a difficult task, um, and they're not going to be able to do a perfect job. So they try their best to accurately reflect the original, but also to make it readable so the person reading it can follow. And that's not easy to do. Like I said, as you guys, when you're translating, between Mandarin English or Burmese or Kachin English, the we don't get it exactly matching. And so we have to add things or modify things to try to make it more understandable. But when you do that, you move a little bit further away from the original.
Mm.
So um, we want to be as close when we're doing diagramming, especially, we want to be as close as possible to the original so that we rightly reflect what the original author was saying. And say, for example, in Hebrews, he had one main idea and then he had these supporting ideas.
Mm.
All right. But if we translated it as two main ideas, then we're shifting the emphasis a little bit differently than the original author had intended. And so the end idea, as we explain it, we may be pretty close using either translation, but um, sometimes not. Sometimes if we follow like the ESV approach, we're going to have 2 points there, and they'll be both equally important. Whereas really the original author was making 1 point with everything else supporting that point. So this is the challenge we face. But like I said, it's not without hope because we do have, if we put in the work and the effort, we can compare the translations and then we have the interlinear, all that will help us to see the differences, and then the interlinear will help guide us to what's closer to the original. And then the challenge is using your translation as you're teaching it, trying to explain this without making people feel like their translation is bad or wrong. Um, I encountered this. I was in Philippines. This was last year, I think, and uh, was it Philippines? Yes, and they have one of their translations in Cebuano is they. This is the other thing too. Sometimes translations did not go to the original,
Mm.
but to another translation. So, for example, one of the Cebuano translations in the Philippines is actually from an English translation. So they didn't even go to the original. They went to an English, and they didn't use a good English translation. Today's English version, which is not very literal. And so we were going over Matthew 28, the Great Commission, right? Make disciples of all the nations, baptizing and teaching. Well, in the Cebuano translation, which accurately reflects today's English version has make disciples, baptize them, and teach them, all regular verbs. But the original is make disciples, baptizing participle, teaching participle, not regular verbs. And the Cebuano translation just followed that English translation. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, now the Great Commission is made into 3 commands: make disciples, baptize, teach. 3 equally important commands. But this is a problem now because it can sound like make disciples is a separate category of like more mature Christians, right? Because if it's make disciples, baptize, teach, that's 3 separate instructions. Whereas make disciples by baptizing and teaching, that's 1 instruction. Make disciples, that's the command. But in the today's English version, it has 3 commands, so it makes it sound like, you evangelize, then you make disciples, then you teach them. 3 separate activities. All right, so that's a big difference. So that's led to, this idea that, Christians don't have to be, a disciple is just kind of like a mature Christian. No, a disciple is actually a Christian. Make disciples is what Jesus said. But if you get that translation wrong, you can make it now sound like different categories of Christian. So we got to go back to the original. And the English translations, like the ESV, New American Standard, they do a correct job in the Matthew 28 passage. But we can go back to the interlinear and see, these are participles. They're not regular verbs. So baptizing, teaching, participles, they modify make disciples. They tell us how. They're not separate commands. So you're going to see this in your translations. We're using the Burmese Bible or Mandarin or our English translations. We're going to have differences from the original. So we have to be aware of that. Translate it or diagram it in your translation. Just start there. It's a starting point. Okay. But then you want to look to other translations and eventually the interlinear to make sure that we have the most accurate reflection of the original text in our final. So what I typically will do, maybe next time I'll show you this, is I'll have my diagram in the English text, and then I have checked things against the interlinear, and sometimes I'll still have the English text in the diagram, but I'll put a line through it, and then I'll put brackets, the more literal. So I'll still have the English translation there, but I'll have modified it to be closer to the original after having done this work comparison.
Yeah, it will be helpful to see your example of block diagramming, Pastor Tim. Yeah, even as we're talking about Matthew 28:19, in fact, one of the common mistakes, I have done that mistake, was to emphasize on the word going. Whereas the word going is actually a participle having gone. It is not the active aorist, which is making disciples. So the mistake of that, and that is a serious mistake, brothers, because by emphasizing on the word going, I make people feel guilty because they are not going as missionary. So everybody felt that I must go, you know. Whereas I think the Greek was having gone is a participle, is assumed that in the process of going, making disciple is the main message.
Yeah, that's right. Let me see if I've got an example real quick from Ephesians, and then we'll finish. Let's see here.
In fact, I wanted to ask a question positive on Ephesians chapter 1, verses 3 to 14. I think
Here we.
it's dangerous to ask that question.
Yeah, we may have to save it. Let me just show you. Um, Here's my block diagram of Ephesians 1. Sorry, the font's pretty small. I'll try to. All right. And actually, I highlighted. I don't know. Maybe I was doing this, teaching this somewhere else, but here's that verse 5. In love, he predestined us. So that's how the New American Standard has it. But notice I put in here literally having predestined. And notice I did not put this all the way to the left as an independent clause. Okay, I left it here because I recognized that it's a participle and it's modifying chose.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and then notice I put here result, or it could be how, but in any case, so I kept the NAS translation here, but then I made a note. And then nowadays, what I typically will do is usually I'll just normally I do this now. This is an older diagram. I just crossed it out with a line. I leave it there, but I put a line through it, and then I put the literal translation. All right, and then if we go to verse 7, notice I do it again. In him we have redemption, but here I connect it. I put it under. I put it under the word it modifies. I didn't have space, so I had to bring it over. And then I put literally in whom. So this is not a new independent clause. I have it under beloved. It's just I ran out of space. Sorry, you try?
Can you scroll down to verse 14? Just want to see all the way to verse 14.
Yeah, again, in him it's introduced, it's connecting Christ. So all of this is really underneath Christ over here. I just ran out of space.
So really, in fact, I think that could be the answer to my question in my mind, that the main message of verses 3 to 14 is a doxology, the blessedness of God. Would that be right to say?
Yeah, there's only one independent clause. This one.
Which is blessed be God.
Blessed be God. Everything else, the whole diagram, all of this actually, and again, these lines here between, that's just, I ran out of space. So really all this means is in whom we have redemption goes under beloved. And it would keep going over here.
Yep.
It would keep going over here. And then if we keep going down, keep going down, all of this still is going to the right. Yep. Keeps going. It's
you need 3 pieces of A3 paper.
Yeah, exactly.
No.
It all goes back to blessed be God. And yeah, it's a doxology.
No, thank you for that, because why? Again, I've made that mistake that, in fact, often people look at Ephesians 1, 3 to 14 and start emphasizing on predestination or election, but really it's a doxology on the blessedness of God. And part of the reasons to support that argument, because it's in verse 6, verse 12 and 14, Paul hyphenate, or in the translation, hyphenated, say, to the praise of his glory. That phrase is repeated 3 times in verse 6, 12, and 14. So really it is the doxology on the blessedness of God. If we were to teach it on, based this on election, to teach on elections and predestination, it's not wrong in itself. But again, as you say, Pastor Tim, it is not accurately reflecting the authorial intent of Paul.
Yeah. Yeah. Blessed be God is the main sentence. Everything else comes out of that. It's blessed be God for his work in our salvation through Christ or in Christ. And so that's the main thrust of the whole section. Now there's deep doctrinal truths, justification, predestination, right? Redemption, forgiveness, the sealing of the Spirit. All of that's in there. But he didn't write that part just to teach us about those things. He wrote it as these are things God has done.
Yeah.
And look, we need to praise God
Yes.
for his
Yes.
work.
Yes.
He's giving us the reason why we should say, blessed be God.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
on and so forth. And then to the praise of his glory. They went on again and said, to the praise of his glory. He repeated it 3 times like a chorus.
Yeah, exactly. So
I think this is I'm just learning this like a few months ago when Keto was talking about Ephesians 1. I was saying goodness to myself, because I see the danger is that by emphasizing on I mean, of course, he talked about predestination, elections, redemptions, forgiveness, and whatnot. But by emphasizing on those doctrines, which is not wrong in itself, we may not be conscious that we are preaching or teaching that section more from the viewpoint of the benefits that we derived, rather on the doxology of a God-glorifying, God-focusing praises for his work.
yeah.
I'm not sure I said it well, but it is a slight but very important twist in the way how we look at verses 3 to 14. Where is the emphasis? It may become almost like a man-centered gospel, the benefits that we receive, as opposed to a God-focused, Christ-glorifying sermon in itself.
Yeah, when I preached the Ephesians 1, my first sermon was just kind of an overview of that paragraph, but the focus being on, I think I called it a doxology of praise, where I just focused on the emphasis of the text, which is giving praise to God. And then the weeks after that, I spent time on each member of the Trinity. So the Father choosing, so I did a message on that, and then the Son redeeming, and then the Spirit sealing. So but the first message was really on the big picture, the main thrust of the text, which was the doxology. So it's kind of like same when we teach narratives, we talked about it. Teach the story first. So what's the big picture? What's the main point of the story? And then you can discuss details in the story after that may teach some other things. But gone way over. Sorry, guys. I know it's late out there. I want to get you guys to bed, but it's all Chun-Si's fault. He asked the question, and so this is what happened.
Well, Pastor Tim, I really appreciate this actually. As you pointed out about the Great Commission, I started knowing that the Great Commission is go and make disciples. But then along the way, somehow, the Great Commission becomes 3. Baptizing and also, teaching become them. But thanks pointing out that, it is just a participles.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Grammar matters.
Thank you for explaining participles. I'm starting to understand it now for the first time.
Yeah.
What is a participle? I'm beginning to see.
It's not a verb or a noun.
Doing the participles.
Sorry, guys, my fault. My question.
No, it's okay.
Short question become a long answer. Right?
No, it's all right, because most of us got it wrong when we were asked to Sunday school memorize this verse. So he said, until some years ago, an American friend of mine says, no, the go is a gerund. And you're going, make disciples. So in your going, wherever is part of the world, make
Yeah.
disciples.
Yeah.
In your going, it means it doesn't mean go there, but in your going, as you move around, as you wherever you are,
Yeah.
make disciples. Yeah. The gerund there. American
All right,
Express
guys.
is Garand.
Thanks for your patience. Sorry we went a little bit long tonight, but hopefully that was helpful discussion. I'm going to ask Pastor Philip to close us in prayer.